northwest corner. Our moderator, among other things, besides being a well-known personality on stage and screen, owns a farm. And when I called him up and asked him if he'd be our moderator, he said, "Bart, it's a money-losing proposition." A little-known fact about Sam is that he was one of the founding members of the Cornwall Conservation Trust. And so it's with great pleasure that I'll turn this mic over to Sam Waterston to moderate resources for farming in Cornwall and the northwest corner.
So thank you all for being here. That first panel was absolutely wonderful, wasn't it? If you want to know why people farm, you got your answer. So I'm a moderator, but really I have nothing to do here. I'm going to say, let's start at the left-hand side of the table and work our way down to the right. Everybody knows what they have to offer, and I'm going to allow them to introduce themselves. I have a list of questions printed out on a piece of paper. Should they stray too far from their assigned subjects, I'll intervene. Otherwise, it's all up to them. Dan Horan is first.
Hi. I guess maybe 5 minutes.
I think you should take as much time as you need.
Good morning. So my name is Dan Horan. I guess I know most of you. I run a business called 5 Acre Farms. I also am a brother, partner, family member of Waldingfield Farm, which is down in Washington. So that's an organic vegetable business that we started 30 years ago. I'm currently running, for the last 9 years, 5 Acre Farms. What we do is we bring local food into mainstream markets. And the principal missions of the business are to keep farmers farming and to have more local food consumed by more people. It's a fairly ambitious, mission-driven business. We sell milk, eggs, yogurt, kefir, buttermilk. We're in about 700 supermarkets and cafes in the Northeast. I work with about 30 farms, also in the Northeast, including Pennsylvania. And the principal challenge that we're seeing is that, number one, in terms of keeping farmers farming, why are farms disappearing, and how do we address that? And number two, how do we make food more accessible, and by that, slightly less expensive, because in turn you'll then drive more volume, which in turn will encourage more farming. So fairly big topics that this business is trying to tackle. We have a small team. We're based in Brooklyn and started in New York, and that was actually my business school essay 25 years ago, which was the notion that regional food and focusing on a region's agricultural strengths had a real business case to be made. I started farming having not done that before. I was a history major. It was fairly, I'm not exactly sure what drew me to it. I think it was just working outside that I enjoyed. You know, chopping wood in the summer in Cornwall and being outside sounded good. I apprenticed with Gordon in the late 80s there. When I started, there was a guy here named Johnny Wells who liked to fix things and was willing to talk about engines to anyone that would listen. So I did that and just started farming. My brothers took time off from college and joined, and now 30 years later, they farm about 30 acres of organic vegetables down in Washington. But 5 Acre Farms, the real challenges right now in terms of finding markets is really in the logistics of connecting the small and mid-sized farm, which is one of our main efforts, to the mainstream markets. So, for example, having a consistent product. There was a question earlier about where can I find your local eggs on a shelf. There's a romantic image of food and farming, and then there's the practical everyday notion that people want to have their coffee be brown and they would like a fried egg in the morning. And if they can't buy it when they go to the shelf, they're just going to pick what's next to them and move on. And so in terms of being a reliable, steady supply, that's one of the first challenges that we focus on, which is execution. So the farmer has to be reliable, it has to look good. If it doesn't look good, people won't buy it. This is not a charity event. This is not, oh, I know that this is supposed to be a good thing. That's not the way people buy food. That's a nice fundraising exercise, but that's not an everyday occurrence, nor is it something that people can afford if they're really counting their dollars, which are, a large part of the population. So focusing on execution is one of the big challenges that we focus on. So that means everything like coming off of a farm in a consistent package. People need to know what they're looking at. It's got to be good. If it's not good, I'm not going to buy it. We all know the disappointment of buying something that doesn't taste good. We often don't do it again. We don't buy it again. So it's got to be good. It's got to meet our expectations. But then organizing the logistics into these stores is really, really important, because if you run a restaurant and you're expecting eggs to be there and the eggs are not there, at the end of the day, you don't really care what the problem was. You care that you don't have eggs for your customers. So a big challenge is the logistics, and we spend a lot of time thinking about that. In terms of the future of markets for locally grown food, I think they're incredibly good. I think they're challenging. A lot of it just has to do with the economics of that individual business. If you're going into farming as a lifestyle, we heard a couple people on the panel earlier that farming was really a lifestyle choice. Well, that's great, and so my recommendation would be to keep that business very, very, very small. The notion of getting, losing an extra $1 for every additional head of cow, that doesn't make any sense. So if lifestyle is what the farmer's interested in, it's a wonderful lifestyle. We heard great stories about that. If making a living is what you're interested in doing, I think the most important thing is to connect with your customer and to capture as much of the dollar that you sell as possible. And there's always a question of scale. You heard up here on the panel, people found that they could make the most money if people came to their farm stand. So that's great. If you live in a town with 1,000 people, that's going to be hard. So you may have to travel with your food, and if you travel with your food, you're introducing expenses. So we spend a lot of time thinking about our farms that we work with and keeping them farming. So one of our missions, keeping farming, is what are the underlying economics of that business? And what scale do they need to be at to make a living? What scale do they need to be at to keep their barns painted and get new animals and get new equipment? And so in terms of locally grown, I think the advantage that people have in the Northeast is that there's so many people here. I mean, there's 25 million people a couple hours south of here that are interested in food. They want to connect with where their food is coming from. So I think that there's a great opportunity there. It's going to require cooperation, because as also as noted on the panel earlier, that some people just want to be out in the field and they could use help marketing, and that's true. So if you need help marketing, you're also going to need help with trucking, and you're also going to need help with selling. And so I think the future there is the linking and coordination of those different pieces in the business. What changes need to be made in the zoning laws to encourage farm markets? I think there's a lot of talk about that. The fellow from HUSI, I think, brought it up, though, which I would put more important, which is the viability of farming as a career has to be proven out. And in some instances, the zoning is certainly working against you. I mean, I understand you can't put manure on the road, and that's a little bit of a hassle, and no one wants a tractor driving on Sunday, and that may not be practical. But I don't necessarily see the zoning laws the real impediment. I think it's showing that you can make a living and that you can have the lifestyle you want, I think, is evidenced by everyone in this room. There are all sorts of towns, particularly in the Northeast, particularly close to crowded populations, that are willing to somehow subsidize either land, equipment, or markets in order for someone to pursue that. In some instances, the zoning laws are, working against you, but probably that's not the principal problem. So I don't necessarily think that the changes, that's not where I would start. I would start on the interest level of the business, you know, the thinking of what are the underlying metrics of that business, and if you have that vision, I would go for it. It doesn't mean it's going to work, but I would think very carefully about what you enjoy doing and then the type of life you'd like to be living. So what we try to do to conclude at 5 Acre Farms is we try to find people that are really trying to make a living at farming, and then we try to connect them with the end consumer. There's a final note, and Bart, you can pass those around. One of the things that we do on our jugs of milk, and we sell, you know, about 10,000 jugs a week of milk now, maybe more, I guess maybe 20,000 jugs of milk a week, is we put the name of the farm on the container. So it's not if you get that jug of milk, it's not sometimes from that farm, it's specifically from that farm. And I think that all the local farms here, and I think towns like Cornwall, have the opportunity to specifically identify their source in a transparent way, and I think that that's going to create a viable business opportunity for them. So I'll stop there and pass it along.
Great.
My name is Paul Elconin. I'm the Director of Land Conservation for Weantinogue Heritage Land Trust. We are a 53-year-old conservation organization. We're based in Kent. We cover all of Litchfield County and a couple towns in northern Fairfield County. We currently have over 10,000 acres under conservation, split roughly evenly between land that we own and conservation easements. Particular to today is that we own 11 agricultural properties. Some of them you could call them farms. Some of them are just hay fields as part of another aggregation of land. And we have 17 farms under conservation easement. And an easement is where the private landowner still owns the land, but we hold certain rights and keep those rights in perpetuity, and the farm is protected that way, or the land is protected that way from development. So our primary mission is land protection, education, and land stewardship. And as we are not farmers, we don't pretend to be farmers, and I know relatively little about actual farming practices. But what we do well is make that land available to farmers on a lease basis. What makes working with a land trust different than working with a private landowner is that we're a very public entity. We're a public nonprofit. We like to think that we have a pretty high profile, though I'm sure many of you in the room may not have even heard of us, which is also a challenge of a nonprofit, is getting the word out and raising money to pay salaries. But as a nonprofit, we have a public reputation. We also have assets so that if things go south, somebody can very easily take us to court, or our name can wind up in the in the newspaper in a very favorable way or in a not so favorable way. So as a nonprofit, we look to have relatively formal leases with farmers. We have a board of directors, so whenever you work with a nonprofit, the land is there, but it can be a little bit of a process to work with an NGO to make sure that our mission is also being met in addition to what the farmer is looking for out of the land. So in some instances there would be a rare species of bird on a field, and so we would talk about pushing haying a little bit later, or making sure it's really early. And we recognize that birds and hay crops are not necessarily compatible when you're trying to make money off of the hay. So we have a dual mission of supporting farms, but also supporting habitat. And as we work out leases, we have to incorporate things like that. One of the questions on my sheet is what kinds of buildings do we own on our properties, and what's the arrangement for repair and maintenance? So we have one large working farm in New Milford. It was a former dairy farm and tobacco farm. It's Smirsky Farm. It's in the Mariel district of New Milford. And we have several large barns on the land. The entire farm is leased to two different farmers. Bill Stewart from Stewart Family Farms down in Bridgewater is grass-fed beef, and Nick Pruder from Mayapple Hill Farm. He runs sheep and has a variety, and they cut hay as well. So I'll just read a couple sentences from our very long and boring lease, just to give you an idea of the arrangements around the buildings. So as you would imagine, the farmers are responsible for the utilities. We make sure that the meters are in their names, and all the electric bills and things like that go to them. So the lessees are responsible for utilities, water, fuel, oil, electricity, gas, cable, etc. They have to furnish all of their stock, machinery, other equipment necessary for their operations. As the lessor, as the landowner, we deal with the big stuff. So we maintain the roofs, foundations, exterior walls, things like that. Lessee's contributions, so it's the ordinary repairs and maintenance of the buildings and the property. So essentially, we want to maintain the superstructure and make sure that the farmer has access to the building, that the roof doesn't have holes in it, that the building is not going to fall down. If it needs to be painted every X number of years, that's the cost that we incur. But if the farmer wants to change some light fixtures or install some equipment in the barn, that equipment then becomes the responsibility of the farmer. And we also have a line in here about installation of a new well. So if there's a farmer who needs to put in a new well, generally the farmer will invest in that. Our leases are typically a 5-year lease with at least one 5-year renewal period. That way there's enough time so that that investment becomes worthwhile. In general, I don't think that we have asked farmers to leave properties. Farmers have left our lands sort of voluntarily, but as a public entity, we have to think about how that land looks, how that land is used, and also there is an expectation of the farmer to be professional in their relationship with us, both obviously behind closed doors, but also in a public face and also in the media as well. So another question on here is, do we provide housing for any of our farmers? We do not have any houses to make available for farming. If we did, we would certainly do our best to make that housing available. We recognize that, especially for new farmers, the land is great, but they need a place to live, and it's very hard and difficult and expensive in this part of the state to find a farm that has a habitable residence. We do know of a farm for sale in New Milford that has a quote-unquote habitable residence on it, but those are sort of few and far between, and we wish that we could find some kind of housing and make it available for farmers. But in general, it's an incredibly rewarding part of being a conservation organization to take that working farmland and then still make it available to farmers at little or no cost. Farming is hard enough to make a living as it is, and And so to the extent that we're able to keep that land in production, that's what we're trying to do. And one other quick thing, the other thing that we're doing is we're working with the State Department of Agriculture. The department is buying the development rights on farmland, and so we're working with farmers to enroll them in that program so that hopefully at the end of the bureaucratic process they will get a check to protect their farmland, which many of them want to do, and then they can get paid for that, and that money can go back to retire debt or invest in farms or seed their retirement, or other avenues like that. And so I'll pass it off to Elisabeth Moore, who is one of the great champions of land conservation in Connecticut and has protected way more farms than we have. Thanks.
Paul says that because his parents are my neighbors in New Haven, and I always let him know when they're hanging out their laundry to dry when I'm walking my dog. I'm Elisabeth Moore. I'm the Executive Director of Connecticut Farmland Trust. We are a statewide agricultural land trust. We focus exclusively on farmland. Many land trusts focus on a variety of different types of resources, and we focus exclusively on farmland. As I mentioned, we are statewide. We've protected 49 farms. We just protected our 49th on Thursday, which was very exciting. And we are located, as I mentioned, we're statewide, and we are located in the agricultural capital of Connecticut, Hartford. So we're a stone's throw from the Department of Agriculture, with whom we do a lot of projects. As Paul mentioned, we are also now under contract with the state to be doing, be providing staffing to the state. As you probably know, we have a budget crisis here in Connecticut, and there is a staffing freeze. So the state of Connecticut has not allowed the Department of Agriculture to replace key positions. So we're providing staffing, as is Weantinogue, to keep the farmland preservation program going. What's very interesting is that while there is no staff to actually protect farms, there's a lot of money. Because in Connecticut, the way that we fund farmland preservation is through bonding, and it's not through the budget process. So there's a unique situation of having a lot of money to protect farms, but no staff to actually spend the money. So we have the lucky job of being able to help them spend their money. And right now we have about 20 projects that we're working on in collaboration with them. And just in terms of what we've protected, looking at Litchfield County, we've protected a farm in North Canaan, a sizable property. We've protected a number in Sharon, several with the Sharon Land Trust. We protected a farm in New Milford that's actually a collaboration with Weantinogue that was done in several phases. We've also protected 2 farms here in Cornwall, one with the Land Trust and the other one is Stonewall Dairy. Which we have been watching closely as Sarah and her husband are going to be taking over. And that's thrilling that that's actually going to finally close. A lot of the work that we do is filling a niche in protecting smaller properties that might not be protected through other programs. And that was one of the reasons that we were created, was specifically to fill that niche. Because as many of you know, majority of farms in Connecticut are under 49 acres. I believe it's something like 63%. I'm a real nerd that I actually know these figures. But 63% of Connecticut's farms are 49 acres or less, and there's not an entity. When we were created, there wasn't an entity to actually protect them. And that's one of the reasons we were created. So many of the farms that we have done on our own have been these smaller properties. And for example, the farm that we just protected on Thursday is a 43-acre property, and the gentleman who was interested in protecting it ultimately donated a conservation easement on the property, and he had spoken to other entities. He's up in the northeast corner in Woodstock, had not been able to find somebody to help him protect it. We also partner, and I mentioned in addition, we partner with the state, but we also partner with the federal government. One of the things I pride us on is that we're very good at spending other people's money rather than our own. We're very good at finding money under rocks. So we get grants as much as we can through the federal government. We also work with towns, and we also work a lot with local land trusts. So one of the questions that I was asked is where can beginning farmers and also farmers that are expanding their operations find additional land? And couple opportunities. A number of towns own land, and I don't know, Sarah, if you're going to be taking over the lease on the you are going to be taking over the lease. There's 25 acres across the road from Stonewall Dairy, for example, that's protected by the Connecticut Department of Agriculture and is owned by the town. And Chris Hopkins had been leasing that, and now Sarah will be taking over that lease. A number of towns do own land. There's also land trust owned land, Weantinogue, as Paul mentioned. Cornwall Land Trust also owns land that can be leased. But there's also a new resource, well, I should say it's a revamped resource. It's come into the modern age and is actually on the internet now. It's something called Farmland, which I refer to as Match.com for farmers and land. So it matches farmers who are looking for land to either buy or lease with people who are looking to sell or lease their property. And there are definitely more seekers than there are people listing their property, but there are more and more people who are listing their property. There are, to be honest with you, not as many protected properties that come onto Farmland. Those tend to be word of mouth and either get sold to neighbors or transfer internally within a family or to somebody who works on the farm. But Farmland is a great opportunity, and again, it's been revamped and is now up to date and on the internet. You don't have to send in your applications on paper, which is a big advancement. And I brought a handout at the back, which is about Connecticut Farmland and how you can get on and what the different resources are. And before I forget, there's also, for anyone who's interested in protecting their farm, there's a wonderful booklet back there called Conservation Options for Connecticut Farmland. And it's written for landowners, land trusts, and municipalities who are interested in looking to protect their property. And one thing I should mention also, and I don't think I did, is that we actually don't own any land. We just hold conservation easements, so we're different from Weantinogue. We do not, to be honest with you, have the staff capacity or the knowledge to actually own farmland, which is what we decided. We do have the ability under our mission to own farmland, but I hope in my tenure that we never do, just because it's such a big undertaking. The other thing I was asked is, how is agritourism allowed under our conservation easements? And it most definitely is. And this is something that is different from the Department of Agriculture conservation easements because they do not allow agritourism. And what do I mean by agritourism? It can be a whole host of different things. And I was thinking about, different options of things that you can do while I was driving up here from New Haven. Pick your own operations are very, very successful and a great source of income for farms. Hay rides, farm tours and open houses, barn dances, bed and breakfast, corn mazes. There's somebody out in the Northeast Connecticut that actually has a lavender labyrinth, turkey shoots, farm-to-table dinners, apple, pumpkin, and wine festivals, demonstrations and workshops, dog trials. We actually have that on a property that we've protected. Sheep and wool festivals. Interestingly enough, children's birthday parties. And also weddings. farms have become quite a destination for weddings, and also camping, which in your neck of the woods would be a strong desire, I would think, because of the Appalachian Trail. So why do we allow agritourism? Because we see it as an opportunity to promote agriculture, and we also see it as an opportunity for farmers to bring in supplemental income. And our easement is purposely written to be flexible, to allow a wide variety of businesses, because there are certainly things that we wouldn't be able to, I don't know, come up with. For example, dog trials, it's not something I would have thought of. So it's purposely meant to be open and flexible so that farmers can have a variety of different options. And again, we feel it's very important to be able to bring in supplemental income, and why we think it's not an issue, which is different from the Department of Agriculture, is that these are low or no impact activities that do not impact the farm or the soils. The big issue that the Department of Agriculture has with agritourism is parking. So if anybody is interested in protecting their property through the Department of Agriculture, you should work with us, and we can talk with you about how to make that happen. And basically, you just have to cut out an area to make sure you have adequate parking. I see somebody's nodding their head. You've probably gone through this process to make sure that you have adequate parking. So there you have it.
Hi, I'm Wendy Kennedy. What I do is I do bookkeeping and tax returns for farmers and advise. And I started out as a dairy farmer's daughter, and I've been married to a dairy farmer. My son, who was here looking for something, you can see he's been working on the farm. So he ran through. We also have some dairy heifers, and I realized too that there's lots of forms. There's an amazing amount of forms, and it's just getting worse every year, things you have to fill out. And I was kind of good at that, so I've just kind of evolved into doing what I do. Farms, financially, it's a big thing. And it is a true lifestyle that people live. The soil, the animals, it gets under their skin, and it's a 24/7 thing they do every day. But there is paperwork, you have to pay your bills, you have to be able to receive a loan or apply for a loan even, because money is not really, the cash flow is very hard on a farm. And I think young farmers forget about money as, oh, we're going to be farmers. We need to think about how we're going to do this. And it has to be a business if you're going to be a business. You have to have a business plan. You need to do a balance sheet. You need to figure out what a profit and loss is. And you have to somehow, like Debbie said, get in there and make time to do those things. And some things are easier, it's online, but if you're not savvy, you have to take the time and go online and do many of the things that you need to do. Have a sales tax certificate, get permits to sell your milk, or permits to have a dairy in the cooler if you're going to sell it. There's all sorts of permits that you need to apply for throughout this state. Soil and conservation, more paperwork, unfortunately, but you know, it's all for reasons that it's there, and that certainly is a challenge for farmers. Finding financing is a challenge for farmers. There is, USDA has certain loans, and the state of Connecticut has grants that they can try and go for. The Farm Credit also has grants and does loan money. And there are other grants, of course, that you can try and work out federally, but that's mostly through USDA and Farmers Home. At the banks, your local banks also is another place to find financing, but as a farmer, especially a startup farmer, you don't have much equity in banks. It's hard. It's very hard for a young farmer to start. And there isn't a lot of dollars, and banks know that. So they really want to lend to someone, if they're going to lend money, that has some equity. And I don't know you know, it's not good. But there are resources, and there's a bunch of resources right here. UConn has resources. The grants through Farm Credit, through the state of Connecticut, there are startup farmer grants. There seems to be coming along the pike more things for startup farmers, because they're seeing that, you know, we have farms, but the children are not so interested into the farming because the dollars are not there. Farming is a 24/7 thing, and it's hard work. And they've watched their parents toil and try and make a dollar and make ends meet. And sometimes it's really, really hard. And it depends so much on the weather. As they said before, the weather is not good this year. And there's many farms in our area with their crops standing in the field that they just can't touch them. And their equipment is probably standing in the field because it's stuck there, unfortunately. So, I don't know too much else to say, so thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Hahn. I work for UConn Extension. Thank you for still being here. It's been a lot of talking, so you've been really great listeners. So I actually have two roles with UConn. I am one of the coordinators of the Solid Ground Farmer Training Program, which is a grant-funded program. We last winter offered 30 different trainings all over the state for free, and they are 3 hours long. So they're really great trainings, from cover cropping to business planning to pesticide use and safety. There's a whole bunch of other ones, and they're really fun trainings. They're often led by farmers, but often led by, you know, UConn Extension staff as well. So we have a website. In the back, I have this yellow paper. It has a couple of upcoming trainings, and it has the website information. So we have an agricultural engineering on small farms for post-harvest handling. Some of the trainings have long titles. That's coming up this week, actually, and we also have a pesticide safety class coming up with Mary Conklin from UConn Extension. This past winter, I attended her training, and she had me dress in full PPE equipment, so that was a lot of fun. I have the privilege of sitting through all the trainings, and I feel like I could run a farm now. So they're really great, very detailed, extensive trainings on things like marketing as well. So we have a whole list of things for new and beginning farmers. We often have master gardeners, and anyone is welcome. We welcome anyone who's interested, but it's definitely geared towards new farmers. And my other role with UConn is the Heart Connecticut Grown program, so I help coordinate and get these posters out. So if you're a farmer, I have a whole bunch of these in the back. They're really nice, and I just need you to sign up with your farm name so we can keep track of who has them. But we really want everyone to have them. I've been going to farmers markets all summer, all over the state to get these out, and I have a whole bunch here with me today, and I'd love to not take any home. My car has 3 boxes, so we have plenty of those. Let me see if I covered both of my questions here. So we do help farmers with business plans. We've also had one-on-one financial training available, really extensive look at QuickBooks and things like that to really plan how to run the business of farming. You can do a great job growing crops, growing animals, but if you don't have a good business plan, you know, they might not get to anyone. Good marketing and good business plan. So that's sort of about it with the Connecticut Solid Ground Farmer Training and the Heart Connecticut Grown program. So back there where that poster is, that's where you can get them. I will be over there, and I would love to give them out to you. So thanks so much.
thank you all very much. Thank you for taking the trouble to be here. It's been a really interesting beginning of a conversation. We're going to have questions. But before we do, I just want to say, many of you here are here as interested people in the preservation of the land here, and as potential customers of the farms. And what Dan said about when people go shopping, they want to recognize the package, and it needs to be convenient, and it needs to be there in the form and the shape that they expect, and all of those things. That's all true. Small farms can't always meet all those standards in an easy way. So there is something that a consumer can do, which is to be willing to go out of their way a little bit to accept the fact that this is not a mass-produced product, and to be aggressive as customers. Because if you want this town and this area to have farms, there's something you can do about it. You can go out of your way a little bit to help. So now, questions.
Maybe Elisabeth, how do you talked about easements, but what about aging barn structures? How do you handle the older barns that we're dealing with?
Sure. There used to be a program, unfortunately it's the term used to be, through the Connecticut Trust for Historic Preservation, and they gave grants to private individuals, land trusts, and towns to protect agricultural structures. Unfortunately, that program is funded through something called Community Investment Act, and anybody who has remortgaged their property or purchased property, you've paid a recording fee. That money goes towards the Department of Agriculture preservation program, the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection or open space grant programs, affordable housing, as well as historic preservation. And unfortunately, the Community Investment Act has been raided to prop up the budget. It's not a political statement, it's just the truth, unfortunately. And that program is no longer in existence. So what I would do, if I were you interested in protecting historic structures or older barns, is contact the Connecticut Trust for Historic Preservation, because they may have resources available. They do have something called a circuit rider that goes around and can tell you about historic structure, the historic attributes of the property. But in terms of actually funding that's available to help protect the farm, or excuse me, to protect the agricultural structures, I'm not aware of any of that. Yeah.
The advantage of being a nonprofit landowner is that we can get grants, and the 1772 Foundation is running money through Connecticut Trust for Historic Preservation for investments in historic barns, but I believe that money is only available to nonprofits that own historic structures, and unfortunately not private landowners. So one of the barns that we own is a mid-1800s barn in New Milford, and so every year we apply to 1772 to get money to do something to the barn, and we have to match that pretty much in cash. So if we have a $10,000 grant, we have to match that $10,000 in cash. Somebody has offered us a historic barn in Washington, and it's a real struggle for us to decide whether we want to take it, because if we take the barn, we have to maintain it. And it's $50,000 for the roof, and it's $50,000 for the foundation, and we have to paint it, and so it's a real cost-benefit analysis that we have to run, which may or may not prove out in the end to be worth it, regardless of the structure. So, unfortunately, I don't know if there's money available for private landowners to invest in their barns, however important and historic they are. But I agree with Elisabeth, call the Connecticut Trust for Historic Preservation. I think they're in New Milford, in New Haven.
Elisabeth mentioned agritourism.
Yep.
And I'm not sure how many people here realize it, but the Cornwall Planning and Zoning Commission is revising the agricultural zoning requirements for the town at the moment. There's been one public hearing. There's going to be another one in due course, I'm sure. And the effort is to expand the definition of agriculture and agricultural activities to allow agritourism, many of the things that you mentioned. So I would like the panel to talk a little bit more. I think we know what the pros are, that is to say, it gives farmers more latitude to do very different kinds of things that are farming related, but not actual farming. I mean, farm weddings are not farming. But there also have to be some downsides to this. And I wonder if the panel has any views about that, because we are, as a town, in the process of rewriting these regulations.
Sure, I'd be happy to start. I think one of the issues, or two of the issues that I can think of is soil erosion from having to deal with parking, depending on how big that agritourism event might be, how often it happens. I know I mentioned that we protected a property that has these dog trials as well as a sheep and wool festival. That only happens once a year, so the impact on the soil is very limited. However, if you had an operation that had much more extensive traffic, that there would be an issue for soil erosion, and that would be a big concern if it was on prime, statewide, and locally important soils. That's, I think, something that's very critical. The other thing is that we want to make sure that this is supplemental income and it does not end up being the dominant use of the property, because we are not protecting wedding venues, we're not protecting sheepdog trial venues. So this is considered supplemental income, and the easement is purposely written that way. Supplemental is actually not defined. Lawyers like it when it's a little bit more loose, but that is harder to enforce. But it's important that it is supplemental income and it does not become the dominant use. And as I mentioned, the Department of Agriculture has taken an approach of limiting, not even limiting, what am I saying? Not allowing any agritourism, and they have a very strict definition of agriculture straight out of the statute that does not include agritourism, and they don't have any intention of changing it. But those are two that I can think of.
I just think with agritourism, you need to be conscious of being a victim of your own success. And if you have a very successful agritourism destination or event, looking at it from the town perspective, parking, traffic, things like that. We have a very popular event annually down in New Milford, and it's become so popular that if we don't find more parking for this one-day event, we've maxed out the number of people that we can accommodate. So that, I think that may be, from the town perspective, maybe the most important aspect is making sure that you plan for success and plan for popularity.
Dan, do you have any ideas about that?
Yeah, I don't know how popular they are. I actually think that, you know, containing any entrepreneurial activity in a town that's desperate for some sort of economic engine, that the cafe downtown just closed, is a bad idea. I mean, if you want farming to stay here, I wouldn't look back at what it looked like, I would look forward. And that has nothing to do with land preservation. I mean, my family has a big property that we want to preserve, but I hear two competing interests here, and I didn't mention this, but one of the big challenges that I see in my universe is the lack of collaboration, and how interests, in my particular case, it's farming, processor, distributor, retailer, they're not aligned. And so the people that have borne the biggest brunt are the farmers. There are no more farmers. When we started farming in Washington, there were 7 dairy farms. There's 0 today. I mean, this is not hyperbole. So that's one. So I think that encouraging entrepreneurial activity, I remember a few years ago, there was a fight up on Cream Hill about whether there should be the composting facility. And there was traffic, and I mean, there's no business here. Do we want jobs? Do we want people to be interested in farming? We have to look forward, right, not into some romantic image. All those businesses closed. And so that may not be what people want to hear, but entrepreneurial activity, we're not going to be able to recognize it. I agree we need to contain it, but I think we need to be finding synergies, and the land is here, people are willing to give it, that's incredible. And I would keep a very open mind as to what it looks like.
Yeah.
That's just...
You're here. You're here.
I would just second that. I would just second that by saying that Cornwall's great asset is its land. And if people come and visit the land, then the odds get better that the land will be preserved. So there's an obvious interest for the people who are interested in the preservation of the town to welcome people to visit. Because then they don't build a house and they don't tear up the land, they just visit.
Right.
Just a quick comment on the agritourism question. Yes, there are some environmental impacts of having many cars come to your farm, but I think that it's a really great opportunity for farmers to get new people out to their farm and find people that fall in love with their farm. And I think it's a really great opportunity to get young people interested in farming and farm businesses. From the Solid Ground Farmer Training perspective, on February 2nd at our farm in Bloomfield, we're going to have an agricultural resource fair. So February 2nd, and that we're going to have some farmers come and talk about agritourism successes and challenges that they've experienced in Connecticut. So it's a great opportunity to think a little bit further as options for agritourism. So, yeah.
How are we in time?
We're good. We can take a couple more questions.
Yes.
Punxsutawney Phil going to be there? That's not my day.
Yeah, I know. He'll definitely be there.
My question is, or I guess it leads into a lot of things that everybody's saying again. And I always think about what grows well here. Grass, we have good water, and to market that grass somehow, either agritourism, but through a product. And a lot of people are growing beef because that's what people will eat, but sheep and goats and other animals that pasture well, not so much. But it's really a question for Dan. Have you ever looked into ethnic markets in Connecticut, the city, Boston, New York, and also corporate markets to expand markets for those kind of products?
I'd say right off the bat, something that our business, and we're a C Corp, so I mean we have a mission that people like, but we're trying to make money. We started an egg farm up in New York State. He had been in the layer business, and then he was going to close, and he bought a small flock. You know, when people ask me about egg farming, I tell them I wouldn't think smaller than 1,000 birds, maybe 1,500 birds, and I think 2,500 you can make a living. And that's now in its 5th year. I think goats, goats are tricky because not everyone likes goats. Goats don't like everyone else, but there's a real market for goat's milk. I think, you know, I was happy to hear Billy say that the Plymouth processing plant is up, because I think processing is a big problem for farmers, particularly in the meat business. But I think that there are enough people close to here, between New York, New Haven, Boston, and direction south, that there are lots of opportunities. I think animals, there is a lack of infrastructure. You know, when we buy a tractor down at the farm in Washington, often we have to go to New York State because there are no more tractor dealers. There's no one knows how to fix anything anymore because they're not on the farm next door. And that's an overstatement, but it's kind of true. So I think whatever you go into, I would make sure that there's a little bit of an infrastructure and expertise. And I do think that in the last, I'd say, certainly 20 years, 25 years, and I think in the next 25 to 50 years, we're in the process of seeing a real cheese industry evolve in the Northeast, where there will be probably 15 to 20 cheeses that are significantly known around the world. I mean, there are going to be hundreds that come and go, but I would say that this region is in the middle of a very interesting time for cheese. These operations also don't have to be big. There's a big lifestyle component, and then there's a profitability component, there's a supplemental income component, and those can all be woven together. But I think that the markets are there. Technology is not, I wouldn't say, a magic bullet for farming, because there's still a transportation piece. You can't wire food over the web, but you can connect people and you can provide information, and there's all sorts of ways that can be. So anyway, I think the markets are there. I think the people are there, and but you do have to seek them, and the logistics are, as I mentioned in the very beginning, a real challenge, and there needs to be a lot of coordination on that. But yeah, I think there are real possibilities.
And you?
Yeah, I think Paul referred to this. There's sometimes a conflict between sort of conservation and agriculture, the two uses, bringing them together, and seeing agricultural land as conservation land. And to be a successful farm, you have to maintain the land, you have to build the soil, you have to control weeds, etc. I'd like to hear a little bit more about this idea, because a lot of the land that the Conservation Trust manages, or the farmland that's under its auspices, is really, to bring it back into real agricultural production would take a lot of intervention in terms of sowing, getting the alfalfa back in there, controlling the weeds, dealing with pests, and so on and so forth. So how do you sort of navigate this potential conflict between the conservation use of land and the agricultural use of land?
That's a good question. It's a lot of it is property specific and sort of historic as well. So I've been with Weantinogue for 5 years, and I've inherited a lot of the farmers who are still on our lands. So in that instance, we're sort of going with the flow with what the farmer has been doing and tweaking it along the edges. When we have a property that turns over, that's when we're able to reassess and take a look at what the practices are. So for instance, down in New Milford, we would like to install more fencing to improve the forage, but also to have some rotational grazing in there. The problem is, as you know, that fencing is expensive to install. And if you get a grant from USDA, it's, they pay you less than $2 a linear foot, and it takes $6 to $12 a linear foot to install. So even with even with yourself, with the farmer putting in the fencing, you're going to lose money on that. In another case, we had a piece of property that was in corn, and we are really leery of corn because of all the inputs that it takes to have a healthy corn crop. So we are encouraging our farmers to move away from corn for that environmental impact, and I think it's very hard to grow corn successfully in an organic or semi-organic way. So that's a little bit of where that conflict comes in. We also try and assess. There's the bobolink, which probably many of you have heard of, which is this little bird that flies all the way down to southern South America, and likes hay meadows that are over 10 acres in size, generally on hilltops. So if we have a particular hay meadow, and we have one of those that we know we have that population, we're going to manage that for that bird because it's an important objective of ours. But we recognize that you're not going to get great hay off of that field, so we're not charging the farmer anything. Or we're trying to encourage in the right year to have the farmer get in early, really early, to get that first hay cutting, and then let it, and then get the second cutting, towards the end of July, which we recognize is not ideal from a farming perspective. So these are the kinds of things that we're trying to balance, and we're doing it on a property by property and case by case basis.
Yes.
Perhaps this is a question for Dan as well, but I think one of the purposes of this meeting was to see how we could make a living, and I don't think agritourism is part of that. A few other issues, and perhaps they all have to do with zoning, I'm not quite sure, but carving off a little piece for housing. Housing is so hard for people to get around here, as well as, is there anything in Cornwall zoning reconsidering the uses of farms to perhaps be a cheese factory or a brewery, or is that going to be a difficult road?
So, I can adjust that.
There's a planning and zoning.
Yeah, go.
I work for the town of Cornwall. I'm the zoning enforcement officer, so I understand sweet peat and I understand soils. I also work for the Northwest Conservation District. Some of the questions that you're raising are being addressed by the planning and zoning commission. In terms of the agricultural regulations, I don't talk loud enough, Sam? I'm sorry. I'm usually not accused of being soft-spoken. But the current agricultural regulations that are being addressed, the Planning and Zoning Commission is also looking at the town plan of conservation development. Housing is definitely an issue. It's being addressed in terms of workforce housing, which is very important for farming. There are some operations, for instance, Wendy and Morris, which is agriculture, has housing for some of its workers. But yes, it's a big wedding event venue as well. But these are some of the troubling things to try and bring a balance between protection of farms and the protection of the neighborhood. And I think Hector has been bringing this to the Planning and Zoning Commission as well. And I know that you have spoken at the COG. Am I correct, from Weantinogue?
Right, and when the Department of Ag purchases the development rights on your farm, there either has to be a house that is in that easement area, or there has to be a location on the property that's defined so that a house could be put there. The goal of the department's program is for these easements and these farms to be protected as standalone farms, so that somebody, if they wanted to and was able to, they could put a house along with that farm.
And you, a lot of the conservation easements the Department of Agriculture. It is based, it's a soils-based easement. And as we protect wetland soils, we also need to protect prime farmland soils. And in the town of Washington, I'm related to the Whiteheads. That's a farm that is, I think, still in operation. But oftentimes, the fact that your best prime farmland soils are the easiest places to build homes has caused certain issues in Western Connecticut for the loss of prime farmland, which is the best farm, the best soil for anybody to grow on, whether they be young, old, or indifferent. And so some of those things in terms of zoning, when we're looking at towns that are looking at soils-based zoning in order to protect some of your soils and to put your housing in areas that you're going to have the best housing options for septic and whatever, while not losing prime farmland soils, which is going to be one of the saving graces of having in a changing, adapting climate, is to have food sources, healthy food sources, clean water on a local basis, that we're not going to be so dependent on other things, including you know, oil and petroleum products that we have to import. So I think that with planning and zoning, I think the commission and the town, because we have some very active people on planning and zoning that are trying to find a real balance to look at how to make farming survive and to have agritourism that is going to bring people into Cornwall. I live in New Hartford, so I come to Cornwall and I'm very thrilled with what I see going on in Cornwall. And because it is a different kind of environment, but it's a tough balance to find in a lot of communities, and I think everybody is struggling with it. So thank you for listening. I apologize for taking some time.
Well, once again, I really appreciate everyone coming to this event. I think we're blessed with two important resources in Cornwall, in addition to our beautiful land. One is enthusiastic, creative, young, and old farmers. And the second is brains. This is a very smart town, and I know that if we work the problem, we'll come up with some great solutions. And so let's keep working the issues and come up with some really unique solutions so that that agricultural school that we had in the 1800s will be coming back in the 2000s. So thank you all for coming. Thank you. Don't forget our annual meeting at 4 o'clock and an opportunity to sing songs with Still the Homegrown Band. One more thing, sorry.
Tomorrow at noon is Stonewall's Dairy passing the torch. Chris will be passing the torch on to Sarah and Jeff. Please come, bring potluck. It's going to be pretty informal, but you'll meet them. It's important. Support those young farmers right now.
So farm on.